If only I'd done things different is a phrase that pops into my head every day.
I think it's too soon to give up on what you want, because nothing's set in stone. All I want is to go far away.
Erased is a story that hit me at just the right time. The holiday season always fills me with a feeling of nostalgia for childhood simplicity that can only really be explained in specific examples that come to mind for a few fleeting moments of comfort amidst a world which seems increasingly intent on crushing us beneath the human-made burdens of adulthood. And a lot of those moments are followed by, if only I could do that one more time, knowing what I do now. It's obvious how Erased capitalized on those feelings. That's what struck me initially, but as the plot deepened, I noticed a lot of similarities between wildly different characters and how their unideal outcomes were based around one singular concept: perception. At the core of Erased, there's really just one singular action which drives the plot forward. Not a singular moment, but rather different variations of the same thing. Satoru, Jun, and Yashiro are all doing the same thing. They're seeking out children who need help or attention, those who are alone. Put that way, it sounds dark, but obviously these actions don't end the same way. One has the intent of preventing a dark future, one is lonely themselves and just wants to help, and one wants to fulfill his own sick desires. But that intent is really the only thing that separates what they're all doing from the others. Because Satoru's plan throughout the series is basically, well, I'll let a simple interaction describe it.
I was thinking, can you let me kidnap you?
I do love that his way of saving Kayo from being kidnapped is to openly kidnap her, but in such an innocent way. It's not like he just said this or it was a line that would come off as a quick joke, it's actually what happens. He watches her from afar, eventually worming his way onto her good side. It's fittingly like Yashiro describes the process to him later.
Your enthusiasm will make her curious, and then she'll drop her guard.
He basically just keeps approaching her while she's alone until she's comfortable around him. So when he kidnaps her later, he's oddly in an actual situation where he could, even if she said no. He even takes her to the same spot the killer uses to hide. They're on the exact same wavelength here, the same actions with a different intent. And it's the same for Jun. He has no harmful wishes, but he's alone with these young kids at the park constantly in his town where seemingly no one else is around. They'll later believe he was the killer because he is in the situation to be one. 3 people with one type of action and 3 wildly different outcomes. But Satoru's similar tactics don't stop there, as when he saves Kayo and moves on to Aya Nakanashi, he's really just stalking her the same as Yashiro. He follows her around to learn her schedule, to see when she's alone to be approached, and once he does, he wants her to drop her guard so he can get close to her. I mean, he's legitimately stalking her here, and it's presented very obviously. We don't see Yashiro's side of things much since he's the surprise reveal, but we do get enough to say he was doing the same things. Hell, he's even following Nakanashi at the same time as Satoru. He just has the advantage that as a teacher, he has access to all this information easily, what his students would do after school, when they leave, where they live, and so on. He doesn't have to be outgoing like Satoru. And we can look at what happened to the not outgoing Satoru of 2006 as well. It's a similar idea. He came home to find his mom in an awful situation, and in his shock and care for her, he moved to check on her before anything else, not wanting to believe that she was dead just like that. It's just someone who cared for his mom, but the situation is seen as anything but. Obviously, this quiet kid with a dead-end job would be the murderer, right? This final thought brings us onto the doorstep of what determines the outcomes of these congruent actions. They're all making these similar situations, but as we've said a lot, they're not doing so for the same reasons. But what happens to all of them, the anime makes it very clear that meaning sadly doesn't translate to outcome. Something else holds that role, and that's perception. The outcome of their actions isn't driven by, well, what it actually is to them, but instead what those around them believe it to be. This is seen simplest in the first episode. Satoru, as a bit of a shy shut-in, someone who goes to work and then presumably works on his stories at home, wouldn't have the best image with the people around him. Irie is really the only person with a positive image of him, and he never acts on that until he actually is forced to. So when one of his neighbors comes to the door to see him bloody, near the body of his mother, her first thought isn't of innocence, but of guilt. And this would be the same thing that drives the reaction of the police and the general air of the situation. To them, it's a logical conclusion, Their perception of Satoru makes it a very easy judgment. This is why Irie is important. The low episode count makes her impact on the anime a bit forced, but it's easy to see why she can trust Satoru so easily in such a short time. Even ignoring her backstory, it's simple. She actually took the time to pay attention to the man and see him differently. She ate dinner with him and his mom and saw that despite how it may look, he didn't resent her, he loved her. He just wasn't able to show it in the way someone else would. She took the time to not just have some perception of him, but to actually know him. His being framed by the killer is also another version of perception, only this time it's a manipulation of it. Now, being framed for murder is obviously going to put suspicion onto you, and that's sadly an understandable outcome. Evidence points to you, so they act on it. But Yashiro isn't just picking some nobodies to pin these murders on, he's playing off of people's already existing perception. Like we said, it would be easy for people to assume the worst of Satoru here, so not much framing needs to be done. Just leave the body facing a certain way and take her phone. It really does feel way too easy, and that's probably the point. This is the same thing he does with Jun. Yashiro doesn't pick him for no reason, he picks him because he's aware his situation could be mistaken for his. Because they're in similar places to perform these actions, he can frame someone else. Then Satoru believing Jun is like how Irie believes Satoru. He's one of the few people who took the time to get to know Jun, not just the situation. But once again, perception wins despite the warning sign presented by Yashiro. Look at how they're different despite being entangled in the same crime. Yashiro is an attractive young man with a steady job working regular hours who's paid to be around kids. Jun is just another unremarkable face in the crowd who could look unemployed despite working hard early in the morning, who's around kids because the park is where his hobby works best. No matter how many warning signs Yashiro gives off, there's already an idea in people's minds of which one of these two would be a killer, and they don't second guess that impulse. This makes Yashiro's framing of him an easy choice, playing directly off of that perception. And even Satoru, the one who believed Jun, is guilty of half of this. He never suspected his teacher, even with ample reason to. He knew from the future his name was on the suspect list, and he ignored it. He continually refused to involve the police with Kayo's case, not wanting to make trouble for someone else, even though they were already making their own trouble. His glove box pouring out candy was easily ignored by a snap explanation. The fact he was in the same place as Satoru during his well-intentioned stalking. He was in the perfect situation to do what he did, knowing the exact schedules and patterns of these kids. This is all evidence against him, but Satoru refuses to pick up on it because he perceived his teacher as something different. He saw him almost like a father. His being absent for the entire anime, Satoru wanted something to fill that hole. And I really like that before this is outright stated by him, they lay the groundwork for it. And this exchange is what sold me on it.
So, Mr. Yashiro, how come you're not married?
That came out of nowhere.
The way he asks this as Yashiro was driving him and his mom home with groceries, her asleep in the back, it was a quaint, peaceful situation that seemed like a family moment. This is what he wanted, and it clouds the truth from him. His perception got in the way, the same as it did for everyone else.
Or
Is this someplace special for me? 'Cause right now, I'm the only one who knows you. The real you.
So what's the idea here? That perception is an evil of the world, that it can cloud us from the truth and allows awful things to happen? Well, yes, somewhat. But we have to phrase that a different way. It's not an evil, it's a tool. It can lead to horrible outcomes, but it can also lead to great ones when we believe. The same thing that doomed this situation the first time is what saves it the second go around. The way Satoru changes the future is all a matter of perception, how he perceives himself and others. The largest case of this is Kayo, obviously, and she's a situation just like the ones we've already gone over. Everyone around her is drawing conclusions based on their idea of her, rather than who she actually is or what she's going through. As a victim of heinous abuse, she forms a defense tactic. Her family would only approach her to do her harm, so in her world, safety is when no one is paying attention to you and no one is approaching you, because when they do, it's only to hurt you. So she isolates herself. Everyone sees this as a rejection of them, and to some degree it is. But this initial perception of the situation without context is what makes the situation so dangerous. Much like Satoru ignoring the warning signs of his teacher, this allowed people to ignore the warning signs around Kayo. She came to school late constantly, covered in bruises. She wrote an essay that was nothing but a warning. But to everyone, she didn't want attention paid to her, so even when they noticed the bruises, they didn't say anything. Or they didn't even look because they'd already decided not to care. Or she's mean, so why bother? No one read her story because she probably wouldn't want them to, they might have thought. And her story, her essay, is a detail I really like because you could say all of this another way. Everyone has a story, and what matters is if we stop and read it or just glance at the cover. No one wanted to read her story, and no one did until Kenya and Satoru. This shift in perception is the start of him saving Kayo, now that he sees her for something other than the slacker thief the class easily believes her to be. I really like the small details they drop in to lay the groundwork for this. At first, all of his interactions with her are met with an internal thought of annoyance, things like,
She's a pain in the ass. Ugh, I hate dealing with her type.
but as the anime goes on, these stop appearing, because they were driven by a perception of her based on the details gathered from looking at her cover, not from reading her story. At first he dislikes an idea of her, but by the end he likes the actual her. And something similar happens on her side as well. Many times in their first interactions, Kayo says something like this.
You're just like I am. You're fake too.
But as things progress, this is a topic she drops and doesn't bring back up. This is part of why starting with Satoru in the future was a great choice. One of the largest shifts in life is the transition from school to the adult world, in a large part because you're no longer forced to be around people. In school, it's a closed environment. Your classmates are an unavoidable part of your world, so there's an interaction that forms from this, however sought out. This is such a large aspect of life, it's part of the reason why there's a subculture within schooling. When you're forced to be around people, it's much easier for those topics and ideas to become relevant. If everyone in your life is talking about a certain game, you're much more likely to play it yourself. So a subculture forms in these closed spaces. The anime even makes some mention of this with a reference to the Famicom, for most of us the NES, and its specific games. Now, once Satoru leaves this space and is no longer forced to interact, well, he just kind of stops. He's a single 29-year-old living alone, working a pizza delivery job with a 17-year-old. So you could say, and he admits, that in school he was faking it to some degree. He took his friend's advice and tried to be a bit more outgoing and courageous. The first time around it didn't work, but the second time something changed. And I think this is another matter of perception. The anime makes a point to bring up childhood superheroes, even having Satoru say,
I'm a superhero.
What changes on this second attempt is him being a fake. He's being something he isn't to make the world better in some way. This sounds odd, but really at the end of the day, what is changing but being fake for a bit? When you decide to change something about yourself or your world, you're trying to make something that doesn't exist begin to exist. The only way to do this is to fake it for just a little bit. To become more outgoing, you have to act more outgoing until it sticks with others and with yourself. You have to change the perception to be that you are, and then you will be. That's one of the weird things of human nature and how important impressions can be. We can believe what we want with little evidence simply because we want to believe it. Like we said, this is how everyone ignores Kayo, but also how she's saved. Satoru convinces himself that he is a hero and that he is outgoing and joyful, and it works. By the time we see him in the future again, he's not a lonely man in a small apartment. He's an adult surrounded by his childhood friends, people who are waiting 15 whole years to see him again and are ecstatic to do so. This is something you wouldn't ever imagine based on the first episode, and it's because he decided to fake it for just a bit. Just like he eventually stopped mentioning a dislike for Kayo's type, she stops mentioning anything about him being fake, because he succeeded. It wasn't fake anymore, it was just him. But this is also part of the danger. Kayo rightfully formed a shield to keep others out because they were the potential for danger. In most cases, she was wrong, and a lot of wonderful people ended up judging her harshly. All around, it was a loss. But again, Satoru was really just implementing the tactics of a kidnapper with good intent. What if he didn't have that good intent? He could have faked it to wear down her shell, then snatch her once she trusted him. Sometimes a fake doesn't lead to convincing yourself and others for the better, sometimes it's just a fake. Like a certain teacher who took a drastic turn. He was more fake than anybody, and it worked. He was hardly suspected despite all of the evidence. Only those who looked deeper, like Satoru's mother and her coworker, even cared to think Yashiro could have done it. Perception, being fake, these are powerful things for better or for worse. You might say that yes, perception is important, but things were legitimately different this time around. He had knowledge of the future and used that to change things. And that is true, it's an unavoidable fact of the physicality of this situation. But it's important that the anime calls out some moments that were the same or very similar. Just to look at one, the Science Center is the most prevalent. After spending some time there, Satoru has a realization. This interaction has happened before. These same exact words have been exchanged at the same exact time and in the same exact place. Sometimes, like this moment of the race, nothing changed despite all his effort. It was what would have happened anyway. But it still leads to a different outcome. Yes, because the moments around them changed, but also because they started to look at these moments differently. Those same words hold a deeper meaning when you look at them as an exchange with a friend rather than small talk with a stranger. They can become more impactful and can change other things. They stick out more in your mind, seen directly as Satoru forgets this even happened until it means something greater to him. It doesn't matter what's happening, it matters why, what's behind it all. That's what makes moments what they really are. Like the Christmas tree the pair goes to see. It's an amazing sight, but when it's someone stumbling upon it, again someone taking someone special to go see it, the moment changes. It becomes something more magical, you could say, all because the why behind it changed because they perceived it as something more meaningful. Perception's also a sneakily infective kind of thing. We already mentioned the thief moment once, but let's dip back for a second. This entire classroom shows their bias immediately as they think, she's poor, she must have done it, and so many thoughts just like that. They're all on board with it being Kayo until Satoru blows up and says something, says anything. And really, he does blow up, and that's what's important. A simple, maybe it wasn't her, like the teacher did, wouldn't have the same effect, and I wonder why he would try to keep her an outcast and not have an effect. But getting back to Satoru, he doesn't really have any evidence here, but he has what's carried every good action throughout the series. Belief. He believes it wasn't her, and he makes this clear as day. From there, the teacher's simple explanation is enough added authority, and all of a sudden, she's no longer the enemy. In fact, Aya shifts to be the enemy in a matter of seconds. Until this point, no one has thought anything more of Kayo, but in that moment, someone showed a different perception of her, one so positive he exploded on all of them. In a way, this becomes evidence, just like how they rationalized the arrests of Jun and future Satoru. Their perception was shifted because his was shifted. And this isn't the only time that this happens. Even before this, Satoru shows the slightest interest in Kayo, and it's like she's someone entirely different. Now his friends have some reason to look at her in a more meaningful way. Satoru is interested in her, so there must be some reason. So she moves from a flat image in their minds to something more. If their friend likes her, then there must be something there, right? His changed perception was infectious to the point of not just them accepting her into the group, but them throwing a birthday party for her, staying up in the late night cold with her, and even marrying her. Him deciding to look at her differently did all of that and involved all of those people in a massively positive way.
After all, you and me are fakes and liars.
What would a superhero say at a time like this?
Now, a lot happens between him saving Kayo and the end of the anime, but I think it falters a bit from the limited runtime, and although in between those 2 points there's a good anime, I think it's a bit more shallow and hard to draw meaning from, more than what we've already done here. So I want to skip to the very end, where we see Satoru as a successful writer. At the onset of the anime, we get this bit of information from him.
I'm scared. Scared to dig too deep into myself.
Readers want to see what makes an artist tick. You gotta dig deep down into yourself. That's what art's all about.
His stories never got picked up because they weren't good, and he recognizes this and even why. He was faking it, faking not to remember the past that could have given him a good story. He was choosing to ignore his own story, and by closing himself off from others, their stories as well. He was trying to write without any inspiration. But over the course of these 12 episodes, he stops to read other stories, to write his portions of them in his own and craft a better narrative. Perception is like framing, like how Irie views him differently and wants to be a photographer. She puts a different frame around the image, one which shows more of the background that develops his character. This is the same thing he does to change the future and save Kayo, just in slightly different words, in a slightly different perception. By changing a few elements and looking at it differently, his story changes wildly and allows him to become a good writer because that's what he became as a kid. He became someone who wrote a better story himself. He knew that all it needed was a different framing, a different narrator who put a better spin on things. One who knew the characters and could put reason to their behavior, explanations, and backstory to their actions. Kayo didn't change, she was just seen differently, and then her world changed from there. Knowing her ending, he wrote her a better story. Satoru is a successful writer now because he became one. And that's an ending I do love. There's a lot of things about a story you can't change. The Science Center was something in his that stayed the same no matter what, but like we said, a different spin on it and it's almost like it becomes a whole different story. That's the power Erased explores, and the one we all have to some extent as well. To be vaguely narcissistic as always, I can make myself an example of this. I have minimal training in everything I'm doing right now. I took a single video production course in high school where I mostly acted in other people's ideas, and I missed failing one of my English courses by a single point because I hated it and thought it was pointless. But here I am now using all of that. And that's only because I took the leap to fake it. I decided this was something I was going to do, and eventually it stopped being fake. Nothing more than that. And something very similar is what holds me back some days. The days where I see that label of fake still being applied to me despite the success I've seen. Where I think this is going to be the video where everyone sees I'm just a fake. What shifts this situation back and forth is nothing more than my own perception with slight nudges from analytics or the world around me. And that's why I wanted to highlight how Erased makes this point of perception and how much it changes Satoru's world for the better. Because sometimes it really is that simple. It's just a matter of thinking, I can be the hero. Or looking at someone with the thought, what's their story? It's not something we can do all the time because we're just limited creatures like anything else on this big blue marble, but when we can, we should. So as I've said before, thank you for letting me join your story for a moment. I hope you can gain some positive perception from this, and I hope I can learn more about your story as well someday. A final thank you as always to our wonderful Patreons with their names on screen now, and as always, thank you for watching, and I hope I'll see you again soon.